en route.
Sony and Insomniac delivered on the promise of a premier AAA Spider-Man game in 2018, providing a robust experience with an elaborately detailed recreation of New York City. After years of being tantalized by the potential seen in Spider-Man's past interactive adventures, this was a dream come true for many. In an impressively quick turnaround, Insomniac, perhaps internally true to their name, released a second entry to their web-slinging franchise, Spider-Man Miles Morales, just in time for the PlayStation 5's launch. Miles Morales impresses in its dedication to uphold what the original did well. Not surprisingly, the scope of the game pales in comparison to 2018 Spider-Man, and it's hard to say that this entry can stand on its own. However, it acknowledges and addresses numerous legitimate criticisms I and several others had with the introductory installment, setting up Spidey for an even brighter future with PlayStation. The game picks up around where the last leaves off, and this is true narratively and mechanically. New York City now has two Spider-Men, Miles Morales entering the fold and endearingly anxious to live up to the name. Gameplay is close to identical too, that is until Miles' Venom powers are introduced in the first big set-piece fight against Rhino. This edition successfully eludes concerns of Miles playing like an echo fighter of his more experienced mentor. Not only does this mechanic provide Miles a more individualized moveset, but Venom's specific implementation impacts moment-to-moment decision-making and enemy design in a shockingly efficient way. Tying health regeneration risk to this power's reward allows for more strategic cost-benefit analysis, especially during the more difficult gauntlets. Speaking of gauntlets, throughout the campaign, enemy builds develop, subverting previous best practices and routines the player has grown accustomed to, which any good action game should attempt to do. I think these ideas could have gone several steps further, especially in boss fights, but nevertheless, the short main story clearly made it difficult to introduce a large variety of combat scenarios. Conveniently, Peter is inching for a vacation, and with his abrupt exit, Miles' surrounding cast fills the void. The Harlem of Miles Morales is expressively collaborative and diverse. A rapport with this region was a priority in the narrative design, as this is the borough caught in the crossfire of the new evil corporate criminal power Roxxon and their dubious machinations. Centralizing the narrative in this way makes for a more intimate relation to the series' already established world building, spending time with a wide assemblage of individuals that actually stand out from the crowd. The supporting cast speaks to a time of intense precarity, political activism, and societal unrest, even to the extent of an almost similar existential health crisis concerning Roxxon's renewable energy, new form, and its harmful side effects threatening the population. I commend the attention given to humanizing these issues, especially through the game's disappointingly few but more substantial side quests involving the citizens of Harlem. I also appreciate the intense earnestness and optimism exhibited by this cast of do-gooders, even if it often comes off quite cheesy and a bit unnatural. This too is true for Najee Jeter's performance as Miles, successfully expressing both the character's inherent goodness and naivete in the face of such tragedy, hardships, and sidewalk mockery. However, this version of Miles perhaps comes off too perfect, too ethically impenetrable even after the myriad of tragic betrayals are thrown at him through the plot of both games. This is in contrast to previous depictions of the character, like in Into the Spider-Verse, where the flaws of that Miles are more pronounced, especially those of a teenager, which provides a more satisfying character arc and a more memorable portrayal overall. And no, the Spider-Verse suit with the slick, unique aesthetic does not make up for this, I think. The best friend tech nerd Genki inhabits a major backup role in Miles Morales, and this new Spider-Man app dodges the reliance on police to structure the game's narrative flow and side quest design. Instead of police scanners orienting Spidey's mobility, the people have a direct line to Spider-Man. Again, an endearing yet somewhat way too good faith scenario. This remarkably simple improvement does a lot of work, as this new interface exemplifies the game's more polished, streamlined design and its more ambitious, emotional aims of the storyline described previously. If only I hadn't run out of most of the available missions within the first few hours of the game, or a number of them being related to the infuriating audio hunts of Uncle Aaron's bygone mixtapes. The events of the plot partake in festive comic book fare, with twists and turns that coalesce nicely by journey's end. It sparingly indulges in the dialogue-heavy walking sequences that intrusively bog down a large portion of the first game. One scenario near the game's ending has a remarkable variety, intrigue, and narrative weight. It kept me engaged in a way these segments often fail to do, or in my opinion, come close to even achieving. Miles Morales also excises most, if not all, of the needless and joyless puzzle minigames that padded out Peter's story. Insomniac still falls on the crutch of relying on cinematics in their boss fights, interrupting what should be a culmination of the player's skills, an adaptation against an especially dangerous foe, for a rather simplified one-on-one fistfight with set instances of narrative resets. Often, Insomniac's impressively animated cutscenes play the fight for you, rather than having a personally fabulated story experienced through gameplay. There are too many lavishly exquisite combat animation cinematics to count, so I do not say any of this to diminish their individual technical excellence. On one hand, the fact that this game feels quite movie-like is due to this, and that's a great feat, especially when viewing player-directed cutout clips online. But in moments like these, it pushes the game itself too far into the background and dampens the enjoyment of what would be, or should be, climactic gameplay scenarios. And much of the level design throughout the bulk of the adventure is structured around stealth mechanics and the implementation of these lavish takedown animations. Large rooms with abundant scaffolding are coupled with Miles' new secondary camouflage ability. As much as I enjoyed the stealth takedown and both the versatility and speed the camouflage allows for, this is really the only scenario the game offers the player in main story combat scenarios. Every distinct location and level design is constructed as a takedown playground, making each combat encounter a repetition of what came before, and this is the case all the way to the very end. The environments are expansive, aesthetically varied, and impressively interactive, but the formula, from a fundamental design perspective, seems disappointingly inflexible. I encountered enough bugs playing on PS4 Pro to mention them here, whether it was the cutscene's audio not playing, occasional graphical hiccups and crashes, or events despawning mid-struggle. It was never disastrous, but often mildly amusing/frustrating. The game overall looks good and plays well. The models in the world gel with increased detail work in many of New York City's textures. Performance is impressively steady, not unlike Spider-Man 2018. PS5 offers a performance mode that, if you're willing to sacrifice the ray tracing and cinematic mode, allows you to revel in a dramatic increase in frame rate. But I'm not someone to usually let technological details take up too much of my attention. As long as I can play the game the way I want to, I'm happy. And that's true for Spider-Man Miles Morales. I was happy with the game. The main conceit of the game, Spider-Man swinging around New York City's skyline, will never stop being fun. I like the myriad of miniature improvements and perspective shifts that tighten up problems that faced the first game. However, the short length introduced new issues in terms of gameplay, content, and storytelling that could have been avoided if the scope of the game may have differed. But that wasn't the hand given to us, and logically Insomniac as well, considering the release date, and so it's hard to fault the development team too much for that. Miles Morales came and went a bit too soon, but it cleaned up the formula for hopefully a successful, dramatic iteration on Spidey and a true standalone sequel.